PEMCAST.
Hi, welcome to PEMCAST. Woo. I should also say our names. My name is Julie. This is...
I'm Pastor Don.
Christian Yi.
So we have a special episode today. Number one, it's P-Don's first PEMCAST appearance. So maybe we can
Let's go.
do like a silent. This is really exciting for all of us. We have a unique episode today, not just withstanding the fact that P-Don is joining us. About a year ago, I approached the pastors with a project idea. I said, how about we apply for a grant, get money, and then learn about mental health, and specifically how it relates to church life and worship in particular. And the pastors were super generous. So we made the application. We got $25,000 as a church to be able to do that. And we spent that money reading books, traveling to conferences, or one conference. We went on a retreat. We continued to have these conversations. And that brings us to this episode, which is kind of the culminating moment of what we've learned. So we started the project January 1st, and now we're in the fall season. And we wanted to put this episode together. Thank you, PEMCAST team, by the way, to share what we've learned and also why we think that this is something that we want to share with the rest of PEM and how it can benefit and edify the rest of the church. You know, we've been talking together for like the last 10 months. There were points when we said mental health so many times that it started to feel a little slippery. We're like, what is that again? So now I wanted to maybe spend a little time and collectively define it or even describe mental health. So I'm going to stop talking now and then turn it over to you two. Help me define collectively mental health.
I would say that my definition changed a lot over the past 10 months. I think whereas I before located among, in the individual, I think that it's kind of spread as a broader, maybe more community focus, I guess. I think one thing I've learned over the past 10 months is that it's not just a individual, something the individual kind of goes through, but it's expressed itself in the culture, in the community, as well as the individual. So, I would definitely say that it's not definition, but I would just say that my understanding has broadened a lot. Whereas before I would look at the individual and kind of define it however they're kind of going through it. Now I kind of see it more in a very broad sense. And I think this project has helped me really open my eyes in that aspect.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Also, I think before I used to think mental health was more of like a privilege. Like if you had everything else under control in your life, like you were making enough money, then you could focus on mental health, or if you were eating healthy and your body, you were in shape, then mental health is kind of like a different thing to focus on in your life, like get a therapist or a counselor or join a church and get a good community. But I realized, I think within the grant, that a lot of those other facets of life really intertwine with the state of our mental health. So I felt, I guess, more of an importance, like that we should be thinking about it, because it does affect our faith. It does affect the way we treat other people, our communities. It affects the way that we treat our body, and so many other things, So I do see it as probably one of the most pressing issues of our time, especially for young people. And I think to properly define is important because you are able to see it from a more healthy standpoint and win people over into thinking that it is an important issue. I feel like a lot of it can be a taboo for especially like older people. It's like, just go through it, like I didn't have to deal with that or things like that. So yeah, that's just some of my thoughts.
Is there anything else you wanted to add, P-Don?
Yeah, just the, a seminary, the one word I think about a lot is Shalom. And Shalom, I think, generally gets defined as peace, but it's really kind of the wholeness of the person and how God created, in general, his plans for either humanity or the world. He, envisioned a Shalom, this unity, this interrelated balance of all things. And definitely with mental illness and those who struggle with it, definitely there is an imbalance in that. Not just one particularized in one place, but how it affects everything. And so I definitely do have a more holistic view on mental health and those who are struggling with it. That it's not, as Christian pointed out, it's not one thing, but it could be your physical health. It could be spiritual health. I think these things are all tied together. Financial, communal, all these things are all tied to it. So, yeah.
So I think I'm hearing you all talk about the interconnectedness of how we experience health. So maybe mental health is not something that's just isolated up here, like here is bad and everything else is good. That actually maybe doesn't happen is what you're saying, but that it's connected to things that are happening around the world, things that are happening in your family life, in your personal life, maybe in your physical body. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it affects the way that we perceive our experiences and the ways that it affects and imprints on us as well. We have to keep that healthy, or else we're just living in different realities from the people around us. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely, I guess when there's an imbalance, the homeostasis kind of breaks apart. And so it affects your just every part of your life. And so I definitely do think that it's not something you could isolate. There are a lot of times that, maybe if you have financial issues, sometimes you can maybe isolate that at times. Like maybe, actually, that's not true nowadays. There's a lot of issues. Anyway, I think the point I'm trying to say is that, yes, I do believe there's an interconnectedness to everything. I think the more I'm looking at this, the more I have thought about this past 10 months, I do see how interconnected everything is and not just an isolated event that it's like that generations can't just say, why can't you fix it, or just pray about it, or just get help. Because, if the moment you isolate it, you maybe pick apart the fruit, but you don't really attack the root of the issue. So, yeah.
I think this is an important time to give a disclaimer that none of us are mental health professionals. And we have mental health professionals at PEM. So obviously there's a lot that we're missing in our dialogue, in our collective definition. So if you are a mental health professional and you want to continue this conversation with us, we welcome it. This is really just about us piecing together what we didn't know coming in and now what we are more aware of. I kind of want to stay on this question though and ask if mental health is interconnected, number one, with lifestyle, with diet even, and with just circumstances, external circumstances. I think I just answered my own question, but really what I'm trying to ask is like, what are the things that are connected that can affect our mental health into states of healthiness versus unhealthiness, right? Like Pidon, you were mentioning like there are sometimes generations that look at, older generations that look at younger generations and say like, what's wrong with you? Like get better. But maybe if we can spend a little time unpacking like what is happening around the younger generations that help make sense of this issue.
Can you say the question one more time? Yeah, sorry.
My question was, what are some of the things going on in the world that might affect our mental health? I can start us off. I think the overexposure to everything that's happening through social media. And I don't just mean overexposure to political things and like scary world, real life things, but also just like what everyone is doing constantly and everything that you're not doing. I think that creates an atmosphere of like where how can you not be anxious about what you're missing out on or not able to do well that others are. And so that's one example.
Yeah, I think there's definitely like a hyper awareness of your surroundings in this generation and in our current time, where the world is set up currently where our minds should be racing. Like there are too many options. There are too many things to worry about, too many factors. We don't know what truth is. Like when we open up a news thing, or even when we talk to friends and family, we don't know. We have to fact check everything. And I definitely think the world currently is just set up for people to be mentally unhealthy. And when that happens, it affects the way we perceive one another. It affects the ways that we engage with our church, even with God. And yeah, I would totally agree. I would say even the ways that we approach our diet and our physical health is completely affected by our mental health, and they affect one another. And I think this is something like, I think even, Pidon, you've like spoken on, or like when you've ministered to like people in our church, one of the first questions you ask is like, are you eating? Are you sleeping okay? And I think, like those things, sometimes it's as simple as like meeting those needs and people not being anxious about those things. And in the same way, like once people are kind of tended to their heart issues, I think people start taking care of their bodies as well. And I think that's super important. And I think one more thing is to be on the my personal passion for worship. It definitely affects how people engage in worship. And especially on a Sunday, sometimes we think it's like, oh, maybe we picked the wrong songs, or the vocalist isn't good, or the song, like the mix in the house is not good. But I would say 90% of the time, it's either like mental distractions from your surroundings or mental distractions in your head. People are coming with different things on their mind. And when I see from the stage or even in the congregation, people not worshiping, it's important. I think now it's very important to me to understand it's not necessarily just they're like, oh, maybe they're like
spiritually dry.
Yeah, spiritually dry, just not loving God today. But it's actually like, can we have some more grace? Like people might just be coming in with a lot more things on their mind. Maybe things are mentally just distracting or burdening,
Then that's a really interesting question or thought, because then would you say that it's important or even necessary for ministers to name those things that might be the cause of those distractions? Unless it's like a personal issue, like your car broke down. How terrible, right? But like, for example, like I'm going to give an example that I know you two are going to be like, whatever. But to me, it's important. Okay. I'm very scared about climate change. Like I'm not like every day waking up like, oh my gosh, like it's happening. And not like that, but it's like always burning in the back of my mind. Climate change, there's like wars on like 4 different continents, apparently. It's election year. That is terrifying as the last like 3 cycles have shown at least. So then without getting like partisan, like, do you think then it is the work of the minister as, our worship director and our lead pastor to acknowledge and address these things?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. But I think, so when Christian was talking earlier, it made me think a lot about why God instituted the Sabbath, right? It's a day of rest. But if our minds are constantly running, 24/7 and we don't have a time to break from the rest of the world, I can see why our worship becomes not of God honoring, but more of bringing these things from the things that we were into the world before God and asking him to do something about it. And, I wouldn't say that's necessarily Sabbath resting. I think you can do that throughout the week. But when it comes to on the Sabbath, it is a day of complete rest, complete satisfaction in the Lord, of letting go of these things. But I can see how, because our minds are racing constantly and they never get a chance to really rest, we may physically be in a place of rest, away from our workplaces or whatever it may be. But I can see it constantly being there. And so, it could be from things like the messages about, God is going to redeem everything. If God is working in here, these if God is the Lord of all things, then it should be able to, instill truth, give assurance that, God is king over our mental health. But I think that's the hard thing right now, is that maybe from the pulpit, it has been we haven't given enough awareness to all these things as well. And so, yes, so I do acknowledge these things are true, and that it hasn't been on the pulpit as much. So, yes.
Yeah, I think when it comes to a worship leader and rest, right? So I think what, Pidon, you're saying, like Sabbath is almost the opposite of the worrying. And then, but that transition is very hard for people to get into that mode after living in like bringing things before the Lord, like real things. And I think probably for worship leaders and any minister on Sunday would be to, how do we stand in the middle to help people bridge that gap, you know, like transition them into, you know, like what you're saying, like rest, and explaining that, yeah, like these things are still present, and there are issues, things that might be making you anxious, like things in the world or even in your own families or communities. But there is a greater call, you know, that God has placed in your life for in this moment, particularly, you know. And I think that's important for me as a worship leader to understand where people are coming from and where we ought to kind of like minister them towards. And when I think about even that process, like there's so many people at PEM now that people are worrying about so many different things, that I think it's not a let's name every single issue, but instead let's we're all humans, right? And we all share the same bodies, or not the same bodies, but we all have bodies, right? And there are things that regulate our bodies. And I think one thing that I've personally have learned is, hey, let's like be aware of like our surroundings, you know? We can like feel the ground. We're here. Let's be aware where we are. Like this is a place of worship and before God and before our families, you know, and let's approach the Lord, you know. And I think that is a approach that I personally feel very called to. And I think some of the service changes recently with the liturgy and kind of focusing our minds back on some truths and remembering why we're here, I think is a huge, like it's a great start. Yeah, I don't know. There are a lot of other things that I think I could talk about when it comes to like preparing your, not just your heart, which is what we grew up saying, but your mind, your soul, your body for worship, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I'm picking up or putting together as I hear you talk is, in an age of restlessness, maybe the step that we need to take as a church and as leaders in the church is not impose rest, but help make rest possible.
Yeah.
I think you're right. It's really hard to slam on the brakes Sunday afternoon and be like, now it's Sabbath or Sunday morning, I guess, and like stop worrying. But like your brain doesn't work that way. Your heart doesn't, your body doesn't work that way. So I think you're right. If ministry can take on the role of helping make rest possible, helping make rest feel desirable even, allowing you to learn how to trust God enough to rest even. Yeah. That's really good. Anything else you want to add?
I think definitely, you know, I had a meeting with like some of the core leaders, and I think there's always this assumption that, you know, once you're more spiritual, whatever, how you want to define spiritual mature, that we tend to forget what newer believers or younger believers or doubting believers, kind of how they're coming into worship. And so guiding them, teaching them. So even post-fellowship, you know, I think this is one of the things that we discussed was, you know, we assume that if there's a bunch of you that you should naturally know how to fellowship, but that's not the case for everyone. And so how do we have a guided process where we, you know, bring people together? How do we, you know, bring them to love each other, to bear each other's burdens, to share in their joys, and then send them out to the rest of the world? And I think, so even things like how to prepare for worship, that it doesn't start on the moment you walk into those doors, but the evening before, how do we prepare for all these things? So I think, these are things that we can discuss on a higher level as well. So.
On a related note, I'm wondering in the last few months, this might be more relevant to Pete Don, but I think Christian, you too, when you're having one-on-one conversations with people in the church or people you train or you minister to, would you say, how often would you say the topic of mental health, both like implicitly, but also explicitly comes up? Like how much of a factor is it, would you say? Because you guys are like pretty on the ground, you know?
Yeah. I don't know if it's, people don't associate me with that specific topic, but I think it's mostly implicit rather than explicit. They tend to come with me, you know, to me with a lot of general things that they're kind of going through in life. And without saying the words, it's mentally affecting me this way or that way. I can kind of pick apart, put the pieces together to understand what they need to hear. But I think people are still in the camp where the spiritual and the mental and the physical and all these things are kind of a little more separated. And I think I'm understanding more and more through this process that it's not as separate as they think it is. But how can we help them, bridge, but also strengthen, not just to strengthen one area, but as we strengthen every area of our lives holistically, then, this is how we best address the issue. So to me, it's kind of more in that sense, I think the way that I've been kind of finding.
Yeah, I would say something very similar. Yeah. Like, I don't think people explicitly say I'm struggling with mental health, but now when I see issues and hear about things, I prioritize, I guess, their holistic well-being and don't just see it as spiritual answers or theological answers, but really, are they being, like, what's going on with their bodies, what's going on with their minds and emotions, and seeing how it's all connected. Like when someone's like, oh, it's been hard. I try to unpack where, and how that's all connected. I would agree. I just started seeing it from that lens now. Yeah.
Now the question that I want to turn to is, what are some biblical ideas or theological and scriptural ideas that we can kind of look forward to or kind of use as like a goal that we are running after? I mostly ask because, I think the other question, the deeper question that I want to ask is like, why is it important for the church to talk about mental health? Other than the fact that, the people that we're working with, it's not just client research. It's not customer research, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's more than just like, where do we meet them where they are? And how do we best cater and like create a better experience? It's not about that. But what are the God-given promises that can speak to mental health and also give us a reason for why we want to talk about it or why we feel that we should talk about it in the church?
Yeah, I think part of the biggest reason is that because God was so open about it. It's like everywhere in the pages of scripture, we have characters who went through and wrestled through mental health, and from the beginning to the very end, it's a common theme throughout. But I think that what tends to happen, maybe just in the, I don't know what other churches are really like, but at least it's in the Asian American churches, that we over spiritualize a lot of things and don't really kind of hone in on what the character is going through and what is God trying to extract from, some of these psalms and the laments and what Christ. We can look at what Christ said on the cross on a very theological sense, that he did this and this and this, but, what about the agony that he went through? What about the seeds of where he questioned about the cup and the Father? And I think these are things that I think the Bible is very open to, that Christ experienced all these, that he was man as well. And so I think it's talking about this gives us a bigger theological lens when we address these issues, and helps us understand the Bible and the heart of God. I think at the very end, that he made us like this, and he wasn't shy about talking about this in scripture. And, and because of all these things, we can go to him, pray to him, relate to other people, and not see them as broken, but see them as people loved by God, and God identifies and, came down, in human form to identify and to say that, we can never say to God, you don't understand. And, but he says, yes, I fully understand what you're going through. And so I think the more we address this, it gives us a bigger understanding of not just each other, but I think of God as well.
So we can talk about mental health because the Bible models it for us.
Yeah.
And biblical characters, even Jesus himself modeled it for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you need a minute, Christian?
Yeah, it's a lot. I'm thinking about, I guess, back to the first question, what is mental health? And how this kind of ties in, I think, is we're not talking about necessarily mental illness only, right?
Right.
And I think that's maybe some people might assume like, oh, when we're talking about mental health, we're talking about like more crazier cases, right? That people might be hospitalized for, but actually more so just the well-being of your mental health, right? Are you flourishing mentally, you know? And I think in the Bible, like Pidon said, there are so many people that go through despair in particular, you know, that talk about hopelessness and then kind of how to navigate that. And I do see one of the challenges on earth is not just how are we going to put food on the table, or even deeper, I guess, not just how do we deal with our problem with sin, but also how do people struggle in their faith, right? And I think one of the biggest issues is that hopelessness and despair. And I feel like that's where a lot of the Psalms of Lament are written from. And I think it's supposed to be an issue that we're supposed to be talking about and focusing on, right, when it comes to faith. So, yeah.
So earlier, Pidon, you mentioned the word shalom. And for those who maybe are encountering the word for the first time, I will ask you to define it, just in case I don't do a good job. What is it and why did you bring it up earlier?
Yeah. Shalom. Before I said that, it's a lot of times when you see the word peace, you kind of see the word shalom in the original language in the Old Testament. But I think for the Jews, when they understood the word shalom, it wasn't just a peace, like an internal peace. It was a peace that extended not just from the individual, but to everything. So whether it's the world, the community, the tribe, human relationships between you and God. And so it's like a wholeness or fullness. It's when everything is kind of, wellness. Yeah, when everything is in balance. That's what really kind of the word shalom is about. So.
Yeah, I want to add also, I love that you brought it up, but just to add, shalom also actually exists less in the person. It is not a possessed thing. It is not something that people possess, which is actually more of a Greek idea. Mm-hmm. And for Jews, for ancient Jews, it was more of a thing that exists between things. Yeah, so between people, there's shalom here. Between my mind and my heart, there is shalom in my body and with like my community. Food, the food that we eat, there is shalom in the network of human life or of life. But you brought it up not just because wellness is important, but because maybe, I don't want to speak for you, but I'm assuming it's because you see that shalom is where we are headed. That was the promise of God. And mental health it figures into this also. So to tend to our mental health, or to tend to any form of health, is living into shalom.
Shalom, yes. Yeah. Yeah, because health is shalom, right? God didn't create us to be unhealthy in every capacity, but to be healthy. And so shalom, health is a big component of shalom. Yes.
I also want to add, I think when I read scriptures too, the wrestling scene, Jacob wrestling, is that Genesis 32?
22.
22?
Yeah.
Something.
Sorry, 22.
Genesis somewhere. Yeah. I actually find that to be one of the most compelling stories like of all time. And I have degrees in English. Like I love stories, but I always come back to that story because there's something about God allowing humans to wrestle with God, to contend for what we need and say like, God can bless and God cannot bless too. That is up to God. But God allowing you to step into an arena and say, bring your grievances and like have it out with me, like engage me, participate with me. I think that's so beautiful. I think that is actually what the Psalms model. And so when the psalmists say like, why am I born? Like I hate this, kill my enemies. Like I think I want to believe that God will not kill my enemies, even if I ask. But a lot of that is me wrestling with God and God allowing that to happen. Mm-hmm. I do think that in the church, when we contend for issues of mental health, when we contend for anything, for the well-being of people, it is an act of faith. It is an act of wrestling. Mm. And the fact that God welcomes it is, I think that's really good news.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah,
completely. Yeah.
Thoughts?
I love that metaphor you said.
So good, right?
Yeah. So we're in the season to wrestle with this.
Yeah.
Already, yeah.
Yeah, and walk off with a limp.
Yeah.
Oh God, no. I want to return to something that we talked about earlier. It came up just briefly, and it was the generational differences. What do you think let's just name, like, what are some of the generational differences? And I want to do that not to create a little, like, a polemical kind of situation, but just to create more empathy across the two. How do generational differences factor into how people think about, talk about, deal with mental health, right? And mostly I'm thinking about like Gen X and up and Gen Y and down. Like that's really where I think the rift happens. Although Gen Y is pretty big too, because technically we're all Gen Y. We're all millennials, but we're pretty different.
I'm like on the cusp.
Yeah, Pete, I think Gen X.
Yeah, but Christian's on the cusp too.
I guess so.
Oh, yeah.
So we're technically all there. Yeah, like thoughts about that? I want to talk about it mostly because our church is a multi-generational church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we have this conversation.
Well, first thing that pops up is a lot of the immigrant conversations that we had during some of our meetings, and particularly because we are a part of a KM and the history of Asian Americans, for the most part in our community is either second or third gen, right, at PEM. So I think that's where a lot of, maybe sometimes we just view it as cultural differences, but I think it actually is part of the immigrant experience. I think our experiences, first gen, tend to be in survival mode, right? Yeah, they're in survival mode, focusing on, like, do we have a place to stay? Do we have a place to eat? Do we have things to eat? Are my children safe? Those are typically the things that they have to worry about. And they don't worry about necessarily mental health, emotional health, right? And I think those things are just kind of on the back burner. But I think for the generations after that, we tend to, now that we have a little bit of stability, and that was the foundation that our grandparents and parents have set for us, we now have the capacity to focus on other things, and I think that is sort of the start of where my opinions on the generational, especially for Asian Americans, the generational differences in our approach to mental health, where it begins for me.
I want to add to that and say, like, what I've noticed, I do not want to overemphasize the difference, like Asian culture. There is no real such thing as Asian culture. Asia is made up of many cultures, many philosophies, many religions, right? But something that I've noticed among people from Asia, maybe not so much now, but something that has like crystallized in immigrants, which they bring today, which they brought here, is that like the way that a professor of mine at Fuller said it is like, life is suffering, right? So it's like, why would you complain instead about your suffering? Like, why are you spending time thinking about your suffering? Yeah. Life is suffering. Yeah. You will suffer no matter what. So stop spending time. It's a waste of time to try to analyze like your relationship to your suffering. Just go about your day. And in a way, I think sometimes that is like sometimes that creates resilience, and other times I think that can be very problematic because for reasons that I don't think I need to name. Yeah. But then in America, because I think a lot of times, again, America too has many cultures. We can name like certain major streams and trends, but generally here, our way of working through things is by talking about it. That is not always the case with our immigrant parents. They're like, what is the point? Yeah. But here, like we have like the talking cure. So therapy is about talking, and I'm not knocking therapy at all, but I'm just saying we have a mode of healing and a mode of trying to understand things. And it is by like making podcasts, talking about things. And so I think that's another difference. And then maybe talking about it feels self-indulgent to some generations who felt like they were punished for wanting to talk about themselves. I can totally imagine like, no, just kidding. Even me too, like growing up, like if I wanted to take time to be like, like, this is how I'm feeling. This is I'm not having a good day, or like I'm sad or scared about something. They're like, there's no time for you to talk about this. A mom has a million things to do. Dad is busy, like we can't stop and spend time on you. And a lot of us were punished for wanting to carve out space for ourselves. And so I think a lot of times when people who were raised like that see someone else, maybe their children or the next generation, be like, stop and listen to me. I need help. It triggers us.
Yeah.
It's like, I never got to do that. Neither do you. And so I think it's a little bit of a transference of pain. But that is not me saying, therefore, the other generation sucks. It's not like that at all. I think I'm actually more, when it comes to mental health, I was a little more on the older generation side because I was raised by parents who, whatever, didn't let me talk about it. But it helps me be empathetic about the difference.
Yeah.
Wow. What was the question again? I was so engulfed in what you were saying. I forgot the question.
The generational thing.
Oh, generational.
Yeah, what are some generational differences?
Yes. I mean, I'm not going to add anything new, but from experience, I would say that I'm in that, my mom came in the late 80s, mid to late 80s. And so she was kind of the first really wave of Koreans that kind of immigrated, here by special rights or visas or whatever, work visas that kind of came in this area. And so, so I was born in the early 80s. Oh, no, sorry. So she came in the late 70s, and I was born in the early 80s. And so because of that, that hard work culture ethic type of thing. If you have time to worry, you have time to study type of thing. It was really ingrained in me. And so for me, I think that's I've kind of held that work ethic, as I grew up. I don't let my mind race on a lot of things, on, worries or what's happening in the world, whatnot too. I think mine is just more hyper-focused on quote unquote work or family. And so, it's really, it's really fixated on a couple of things. But, so it's not to say that my mind isn't running all the time, but it's more hyper fixated on that. And I think that when I talk to a lot of younger people, they definitely are looking at things with bigger eyes. It's not really that racehorse, I guess, focus on the finish line. But for them, their perspective is broadened a lot. And so, yes, sometimes I get off guard a little bit when they ask me, do I care about a lot of these things? Because, I'm not heavily into social media. I don't feel the need to check and open up very often. I don't know what's happening in the world all the time. And, that's either a blessing or a curse, depending on who you ask. And so, so because of that, I think I've adopted a lot of the early immigrant, Korean American immigrant, second gen mentality. And, and I do recognize that, I'm maybe 2.0. I recognize there's 2.5 or 2. Whatever. But because of that, I'm very more focused on that kind of mentality. And so when I talk to a lot of older people at PEM, who have very similar kind of mindsets when it comes to what's happening in the world, social justice and all these things, they're very kind of hyper-focused more on what's in front of them. And, it's just identifying what's really that which captures your attention, I guess, the most. And, it could be good things, it could be bad things, but I think bridging that I think is going to be very vital as now we are raising now the next generation of, people in the church. And,
I'm trying to think about where my mind tends to go when there are a lot of options, and I do get overwhelmed. Even after service, we're picking a place to eat, and we're like, "Oh my gosh, there's 6 different places, right?" If you just gave me 2,
only 6,
yeah, that's a blessing in itself. Only 6, but if we were only given 2, how much easier would it be? And maybe our job as people in the church is to kind of root people or ground people into what's in front of them, what they're living in. This is so meta, but what they're experiencing right in front of their own eyes instead of going to their phone or thinking about past things is probably the best option and you feel the most connected to, because your body is there, your eyes see what's happening, you feel it, you hear it, right? And I think that's, when I bring it back to worship, that's probably one of the, like, unpacking it, I feel like that's one of the reasons why it's hard to engage, you know, in worship, because you have to be there, like, in every way, right? You have to be in the moment, thinking, connecting with people. So I wonder, sorry, it was a little bit jumbled, but I think all in all, just bringing people to the best option, which is to live in the present and to experience and to think about what's around you, I think is, I feel, as we're talking about, I feel more called to that way of thinking and ministering to people too.
I think being present is actually a very scary thing to have to do. Like, to face reality is something that many people might choose. Like why should I? Especially not at church. Like, this is the moment where I can forget. Mm-hmm. And you know what? If that is where you are on a certain Sunday, I think that's okay. I think, but when that becomes the habit, like church is where I dissociate from the rest of the world. Maybe that's something that we can all kind of work on together. Anything you wanted to add to either of you to that? Yeah,
I mean, is that really faith if you're dissociating from the world, right? Like, what is there to lay before God if you are dissociating, you know? And I think to be in the most present state is your potential for sacrifice and to grow in your faith, I think, is the highest, you know?
Well said.
I would say any approach to faith that has like dissociation, like an active trying to dissociate, I think it actually harms the faith, and I would say, it's not beneficial. So
that's good.
That's so good. Like, faith is only really faith when it is grounded in reality.
Yeah.
And when
100%.
it has not compromised a sense of reality.
Yeah.
Yes.
Otherwise, that's...
Yeah.
And that's why conversations are so good, right? Because we're manifesting the things that we're feeling, the things that we're experiencing. I could go on a whole different tangent with, but yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to turn us to the last question. And this, you might want to like start sorting through what we've learned, think about the syllabus. We made a syllabus for the grant project. And we had readings and we had discussions. So kind of going back to all those things, we spent an entire year, basically like 9 months reading and learning and discussing ideas. A big part of it was like, okay, well, now that we've learned all these things, like, what do we do with it? So that it doesn't stay in just intellectual forms. So what do you hope to inject into the stream of PEM's collective life, right? So that it doesn't stay, number one, isolated up here, but also it doesn't stay isolated among the 8 of us who are doing this work together, but so that it makes its way to the body of Christ at PEM.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the first things that popped into my mind was, of course, for my immediate worship team. And it's been, if you're on the worship team, you guys know, like, there has been a little shift towards breathing exercises and mental, I guess, stability, like before worship. But I would love to see more of like body regulation, you know, breathing exercises more integrated into teams and maybe even hosts and just like trainings, I guess. It doesn't have to be like from I don't know if I should say it, but it doesn't have to be from like a mental health expert, but because we all have bodies and we all have minds, we know certain things work, and just having team leaders direct their teams into making their perspective more grounded in what's in front of them, right? Like, what is really going on here, right? Like, am I worried about like what note I'm going to play or this thing I'm going to sing? But having them more grounded, hey, like, we're here with one another, like worshiping God and serving Him. And I think more training on how to get your teams present I think is really important because PEM is growing a lot. I know many teams, including my own, where people have cried and broken down because of stress and anxiety, or like they got hurt, or their minds are just racing all over the place. But I think having that kind of training, knowing how to get people regulated and, grounded, I think is really important. Yeah. I could go on and on about that, but even with the congregation and leading worship, just thinking about how to get people grounded, I think is important.
Yeah, I think that for us, when we started this project, it was the focus was on the staff, the pastors and the staff, and I think we recognize that a lot of change doesn't happen unless it's top down, and so the more that we educate, those who are leading God's people in various aspects, we thought that it would trickle down into conversation and whatnot. And so I think, not to say that I know exactly how this all pan out, not to say that I can foretell the future. But I think the end goal for everything for me is, will you love God more and will you love each other, God's people more? I think that's when I think about wellness and wholeness and shalom and all these terms that we've been using. I think when all of these things are well and functioning correctly and we're in community the way it should be, I think it does lend itself to us loving God more and each other more. And so it's definitely made me more aware of people as a whole, right? That they're not just coming to me with a specific subset of issues or whatever it may be that they're kind of wrestling with. It's given me a very holistic view of the person and making sure that in my mind I'm like checking off all these things. How are they doing? Internally and externally as well. And so when it comes to anything specific, I think there's something that I think as we are wrapping up this grand project, with the pastors, we're trying to meet up this upcoming week. I think these conversations will start coming up, how we can now implement them in a tangible way. Do I have exactly a ABC step type of thing? I actually don't honestly in this moment, but I do know that I've learned a lot from this project. I've gained a much bigger respect for the people in this project. I've had a bigger understanding of my God and his heart towards us. And I hope that as we continue talking amongst the grant team project, that we can outline specific ways. Like for example, like starting with this podcast, and then, having that, have people come to us and, just share with us what they're going through and what they've learned and how we can build off of that. So for us, we're a good place at PEM because, I think, at least before this project, maybe our doors a little more weren't as open because, I think I wasn't as informed and, just coming from a half generation up from a lot of our church members. But I think now that I am a little bit more informed, I have different eyes. I have eyes that kind of see a bigger spectrum. It helps me then identify in my thinking, in my interactions and the planning of how we can now address, what does it mean to be mentally healthy and well and all these kind of things. So I think for me, maybe if I was the biggest, bottleneck of the church when it comes to a lot of these things, at least that bottleneck has been opened up a little bit more. And so the flow is a lot faster now coming into the church. So, yeah.
I'm just going to offer some of my thoughts.
Yeah.
Mine are not so specific only to PEM. And I think every church has its colors. Every church has things that they care about, their priorities and their cultures. And not every church has to be like the same, obviously. I do think though, going back to like our first topic about the holistic health, thinking about health holistically. Oh my gosh. That's something I care deeply about. I think things out in the world are affecting us whether we know it or not. And I think that if there are people who have reason to be brave, humans in general, I think, should have the capacity to be brave and a reason to be brave. But I think our specific hope as Christians is the fact that Jesus lives and that Jesus has commissioned us, the church, has promised to return. And I think that opens us up to so much courage. I think a lot of times mental health, at least the way I have experienced it, I will not speak on the general end, is feeling very too small compared to my problems, and then succumbing to that like perceived smallness. Like, I can't ever get over this. This is not something I can do. Like, this is too much. All of that. Like, it's a lot of like belittling language in my mind. I don't know where I'm going with this. I think the point is I would love for the church, the capital C church, to feel emboldened and empowered to be able to talk about things that feel scary, knowing that we have the power of resurrection, not to be arrogant with it, but as a promise that if you live selflessly, if you lose your life, you will gain it. I would love to see the church stand up, for things that matter. Like, I think so much of, at least my experience with, I don't think mental illness, but the most vulnerable I felt mentally and emotionally, especially during COVID, was seeing the racism against Asian Americans, Asians and Asian Americans. And whether we admit it or not, whether people admit it or not, I'm willing to bet that somewhere a majority of us, even at PEM, have that lodged in our memory. It's hard to forget the stuff that we saw.
Yeah.
It was really bad. And those are the things that I think affect our mental health, again, named or unnamed. Yeah. And I think those are the things that, at least if I can even call it like a ministry that I care about or ministry that I want to do, is working through that. Yeah. Not to make an idol out of social justice, but because we're hurting. Yeah. And I think our communities need a prophetic and a pastoral word through something like that.
Yeah, that's something that I think, when I think about, maybe a lot of pastors might talk about like specific sins, like anger. I find when I dig deep in my heart, I find myself dealing with those sins and brokenness a lot of times in the context of some of the racial trauma that I felt in my life growing up. So me and Pete Don talk about this like occasionally, but like we were bullied like for being Asian, right? And I think that it's ingrained in me, and I do tend to have like trauma responses to my heart rate goes up, like I get anxious sometimes, or I get really angry and defensive to the point where I feel like I could fight, and I think when I think about my own faith journey, I can't move on into growing into more like Christ unless I come to terms with what happened in my life and I bring it before the Lord, right? And I think a lot of the current, there's a lot of different views on racism and, systemic or whatever. But one thing is for sure is that, like I witnessed it and I went through it, and it can't be, I guess, it can't just be like a Band-Aid solution just to talk about it, but it's something that like I need to be ministered through, Yeah.
Yeah. The way that I always dealt with racism and being bullied was the sweep it under the rug approach, and that it was so ingrained that this was natural life for me growing up that it was better for me to not think about it. And I think that that's how I've dealt with a lot of things in my life. If I'm really being honest, kind of, there's always going to be problems. There's going to be issues. Just think about the good. They're thinking about the hope, right? And I think that 2021, 2021, 22, more 2021, I would say, when API and BLM, all these things were happening, it for the first time opened the rug, and I saw the dirt, And I think especially it hit home for me the most when my daughter was bullied. And it brought me back to those places where I tried to hide and run away. And so that was a very, it's one thing to listen to members and how they deal with these things. It's another thing to see your own flesh and blood go to the things that you were trying to avoid, right? So same thing of how our parents, when they came to America, they want us to avoid poverty and whatnot too. I wanted my daughter to not necessarily avoid poverty because we're pastors or whatever, right? For my thing, it was more of like to avoid the racial poverty and racial abuse that I went through by shielding her. And so I think it was really good for me to then sit down and talk with her. The things that people say, these comments about, you're Asian, so you must eat dogs, right? Like her hearing that and asking me, what does that mean, Dad? And to sit down and to unravel these things. I think, that's why I think it's so generational, right? No one suffers uniquely and alone. We all suffer, as a community. And so, so I think this is why it brings a lot of hope that if someone stubborn as me who sweep things under the rug can start lifting up my rug and embracing these things and traumas and hurts that, I think there's hope for the generations at PEM and the church and beyond. So,
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. I want to end it here on this note. One last question. So I guess we're not ending here on that note. We read a handful of things. We read some articles. We read some books. Any recommendations for people who might be interested in learning more?
I personally really liked Family Systems, the Robert Creech.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one I think helped me understand how to be a leader, like a minister and a shepherd to people.
Yes.
So I feel like if you're in any type of leadership position where you're dealing with people, it helps you lead not as a tyrant and a little bit more empathetic to people and what's going on, right? And not seeing them, man, are they just made that way, or what's wrong with them?
Yeah.
And you start to understand a little bit more, like, oh, like I wonder what's stressing that person out or what they're anxious about. So, highly recommend that one if you're like in a shepherding or team lead position.
It should be required reading for all house church / shepherds.
That's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just created so much work for them.
Blame Julie. I agree. I think that book, at first I didn't understand how they're applying these things, but I think the more I read it, it made me give a different perspective on the individual relationship to the whole. And I thought that was a really good book. Very pastoral in the way they looked holistically of the whole group. And so I think that book especially opened up my eyes a lot on how to look through a wider lens, I guess. Not to see the suffering person as he or she is, but to look at how we're all interconnected, right, to one another. So I think that's my big word, interconnected. So
I would also say like all these books, we might not agree with a lot of the things. Like we had to wrestle with a lot of the concepts. And I think even coming out, like we learned a lot, but we also knew what we didn't receive from those readings too, which was, I think, also helpful. So just a disclaimer, I think if you read it, it doesn't mean everything in that book we all agree on, but they're all helpful tools that I think could help a lot of people.
And try to read them with other people. I would say, to kind of balance each other out.
Yeah. I also love the Christianity one, the Understanding Christian Living.
Enhancing Christian life?
Enhancing Christian
that
life.
Was good.
Yeah, that was really good too.
I liked Wisdom of Your Body. Just because it centers something that we don't talk about. And it was good at helping us understand how trauma is. Well, at this point, this is a very this is like a well-known fact, but that trauma actually resides in the body. It's lodged where it had the impact. And then so obviously like when you have
That's
like
true.
microaggressions,
that.
obviously it stays up here, but it has an effect throughout the whole body.
Yes.
It says something like depression might be like anxiety burnout. And I was like, whoa, like that's actually, I think she said that. I don't know. That's what I got out of it. But that connection of like you're anxious, you're living life anxiously. And then the point where you start to kind of like fade away from that, or like you no longer have the fuel to keep going, is what we might call depression at times. I don't know. There was a lot of practical wisdom that I got out of it.
Yeah.
We'll drop the book links
Down
in
here.
the exactly. Yeah. Also, maybe Interconnected should be our new church name. Interconnected
Ooh,
English
church.
Ministry. That is a wrap. Thank you
All right.
both so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us and for watching, y'all. Bye.